Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dig into the United States Agency for International Development, USA.
Right.
And I think most of us have a sort of general picture of what they do.
Absolutely. Yeah, when you hear USA, you probably think about giving aid to fight poverty, maybe health programs, education, helping economies develop globally.
Exactly.
That's definitely, the core of their public mission statement.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the common view. But today, we're going to try and look at USAID from a slightly different angle.
Okay.
This idea that it's also maybe functioned as a way to, well, influence what goes on inside other countries.
Okay. Yeah, that sort of brings up the whole Trojan horse idea, doesn't it? Something that looks beneficial, maybe even like a gift, but it might have other things hidden inside.
Right.
So in international development diplomacy, it suggests that things presented as purely helping might also have, let's say, other aims.
Okay, so let's unpack that metaphor, the Trojan horse, specifically with USAA. Since it started back in '61, beyond the obvious humanitarian work, some people argue it's also been used for, well, maybe behavioral influence.
Behavioral engineering, even. Projecting American soft power, yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes maybe even playing a part in destabilizing regimes the U.S. wasn't friendly with.
So are there specific examples that kind of flesh this out?
Well, yeah, there are quite a few that get brought up. If you look at Cuba, for instance, there was this effort to work with the Cuban hip-hop scene.
Okay.
The official reason, HIV prevention. That was the banner it was under.
But the, let's say, alternative interpretation is that the real goal was to subtly weave anti-government messages into the music.
Exactly, to reach young people, with a certain perspective. And apparently, when this got exposed, it caused some real problems for the artists involved.
I imagine.
Yeah. And then there was also the Zunzunio project, also in Cuba.
What was that?
It was basically a secret SMS-based social network, kind of like an early basic Twitter built on text messages.
Okay. A bit clandestine.
Very. And initially, it was set up to look totally harmless. Talk about soccer, music, weather, general stuff.
Right, non-political.
Totally. But the alleged plan, the longer game, was to build this big user base and then eventually start pushing messages that encourage dissent, maybe even organize protests.
But it didn't get that far.
No, it got exposed in the media, Associated Press, I think, and then it was shut down pretty quickly after that.
Okay, so Cuba's one area. What about elsewhere? You mentioned Venezuela, Bolivia.
Right, the whole democracy strengthening angle.
Right.
Through USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, OTI, they call it.
And OTI is specifically for?
It's designed for rapid, short-term political change assistance, helping during transitions, supporting what they see as democratic processes. So in Venezuela and Bolivia, OTI apparently funneled quite a bit of money to opposition groups.
And the point here isn't about whether those groups were good or bad, but more about the intent behind the funding. Right?
Exactly. Was the goal from the U.S. side really just supporting democracy in the abstract, or was it specifically trying to shift power away from governments that weren't aligned with U.S. interests?
It does raise questions about the actual impact.
Yeah.
Did it help democracy long term? Or did it maybe just add fuel to the fire, create more instability?
That's the debate. It's definitely about trying to shape the internal politics. You could also look at Rory Stewart's Turquoise Mountain Project in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. Focused on cultural heritage crafts.
That was the main public focus, yes, preserving Afghan culture. But some analyses suggest it also functioned as a way to build soft power.
How so?
Well, by funding cultural preservation, you create goodwill, you make foreign involvement seem positive and constructive, it subtly builds acceptance for, external influence.
Interesting. So even something that looks purely positive, like saving culture, could have these other sort of geopolitical layers.
Potentially, yeah. And you see similar discussions around activities in Central Asia, like Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Yeah. USAI ran campaigns there promoting Western ideas about gender roles, media freedom, civic duty.
Things that sound universally good, maybe.
On the surface, yes. But they apparently ran into some friction because these ideas sometimes clash pretty directly with local traditions or political reality.
All right, leading to pushback.
Yeah, in some cases, political backlash. It shows that tension when external values meet different local contexts.
Okay. And then there are the white helmets in Syria.
Oh, yes. The volunteer rescue workers, definitely funded by USAID and other Western allies.
Their main job was rescue, pulling people from bombed buildings, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And incredibly dangerous work, no question. But they also became very, very effective at public relations.
Meaning?
Their videos, their stories, they powerfully shaped how the world saw the conflict. So while doing vital rescue work, they were also essentially managing a global narrative. And in a war, controlling the information is huge.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, fast forward a bit. What about more recent stuff, like tech?
Yeah, that's another area. USAID has funded digital voting systems, civic tech platforms in places like Kenya and Nigeria,
A stated goal being.
usually framed as promoting fair elections, transparency, using technology for good governance,
But the counter-argument.
is that it can create a dependency on Western tech. And potentially it gives external actors a certain amount of insight, maybe even leverage, over electoral systems. It positions Western solutions as essential.
Right. And looking at all these examples together, the idea isn't that these are just like isolated oopsies or random projects.
No, the perspective we're exploring suggests this might be part of a bigger pattern, a systemic strategy maybe, rather than just one-off incident.
Okay. Now, you mentioned something about a shift. USAID's behavioral arm and an executive order.
Yeah, Executive Order 14169. There are reports that after this, USAID's behavioral science unit saw significant changes. But the argument isn't that the U.S. just stopped trying to influence things.
Right. It wasn't like, okay, game over, we're done.
Not according to this view. It was maybe more of a strategic pivot. USAID was getting a lot more scrutiny, right? So the idea is the activities didn't disappear, they just shifted. Yeah. Moved elsewhere, maybe to actors who are less directly accountable to, say, Congress or diplomats.
Okay, so what was the effect of that shift? What changed on the ground?
Well, reportedly, programs focused on things like gender equality initiatives or support for civic resistance groups, empowering minority communities. That funding started drying up, or the programs just stopped.
Which would leave a gap, presumably?
A pretty big one in some places. You're talking about youth centers closing down, independent media outlets that relied on that funding struggling or folding.
Wow.
Yeah, and losing support for organizations that train activists, run workshops, the kind of civil society hubs that can influence elections or public debates about culture and values.
When that funding goes, the whole landscape changes.
Definitely. And the reaction wasn't uniform everywhere. Some governments were probably quite happy to see less of that kind of perceived interference. But in other places, groups that relied on that support were suddenly scrambling, looking for other ways to keep going, maybe seeking funding from different sources.
Which leads to this idea you mentioned earlier. The deep state doesn't retire. It rebrands.
Kind of catchy, isn't it? But yeah, the argument is that American soft power, this influencing capacity, it didn't just evaporate, maybe just migrated, found new homes.
Like where?
Well, one area often pointed to is private philanthropy. Big foundations, like George Soros's Open Society Foundations, the Gates Foundation, the Amidyar Network.
How do they fit in?
They fund a lot of initiatives globally that promote specific values, specific types of development, democracy promotion, similar goals perhaps to what USAID was doing. But crucially, they operate with much less direct government oversight.
Less diplomatic scrutiny, maybe.
Exactly. It's harder for other governments to complain about a private foundation compared to a state agency like USAID.
Okay, so private philanthropy is one avenue. What else?
Public-private partnerships are another big one. So things that might have once been clearly a USAID project might now be presented as, say, an innovation hub, or impact investing, or a climate tech accelerator.
Ah, so embedding the influence within something that looks like business or tech development.
Precisely. The argument is that you can still do the behavioral nudging, the agenda setting, but it's wrapped up in the language of economic opportunity or environmental progress. It's less obviously political.
Clever. What about the military's role in this shift?
Well, there are some suggestions that certain functions, maybe psychological operations or influence campaigns that were under civilian control, might have shifted back towards the Pentagon.
Really?
Yeah, reports of military public affairs teams working more closely with NGOs, sometimes with, let's say, unclear funding trails, doing civic outreach in different regions.
That definitely blurs the lines between military action and civilian engagement.
It does. And then finally, you have the role of organizations like the IRI, the International Republican Institute, and the NDI, the National Democratic Institute.
Which are directly linked to the U.S. political parties, right?
Correct. And they've become increasingly active. They train political activists overseas, help set up political parties, fund local media outlets, all officially under the umbrella of democracy strengthening.
So it's like the influence toolkit has diversified, more actors, maybe more subtle methods.
That seems to be the core idea, yes. These Trojan tactics, as we called them, haven't gone away.
Right. It's not saying all aid is secretly subversive, Or every single NGO is a front.
No, absolutely not. But when you see consistent funding patterns going towards inherently political areas, media, education, activist training, civil society groups, it does raise the question, is the goal just humanitarian aid, or is there also an element of shaping the environment?
So the modern Trojan horse might not be wood. It might have a foundation's logo or be funded by a public-private partnership grant.
Could be. It might talk about human rights or innovation or climate change. But the underlying goal, according to this perspective, is still about creating a global landscape that's more favorable, perhaps, to certain interests.
And the scaling back of the more overt USA behavioral stuff wasn't the end, just a change in
A
tactics.
transformation, yeah. Different methods, different channels, the form changes, but the underlying dynamic of trying to exert influence arguably continues.
So wrapping up this deep dive then, I guess the main takeaway for you, the listener,
Yeah.
is really about looking beyond just the surface layer.
Yeah, thinking critically about international development, aid projects, understanding that even things that seem purely good or benevolent might have other complex layers, maybe hidden agendas operating on the global stage.
It definitely gives you something to think about. A final thought, maybe. As these methods of influence keep changing and evolving, how do we keep track? How do we analyze these complex international dynamics accurately?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Constant vigilance and critical thinking are key.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.